Michelle Obama strode into the Cook County Courthouse in Chicago, Illinois, her heels clicking against the cold marble floor with a rhythm that announced her presence before she even spoke. The courtroom was a cavernous space, its high ceilings and dark wood paneling steeped in the weight of countless legal battles. But today, it felt different. Electric, alive with the promise of something monumental. She carried a sleek leather satchel under one arm, stuffed to the brim with files that represented weeks of relentless work, her posture straight as a steel rod, her eyes sharp and unwavering. She was no stranger to pressure. Years as a lawyer at Sidley Austin had forged her into a formidable advocate, and her later life in the public eye had only honed that edge. But this case was a beast of its own. Across the room, behind the towering oak bench, sat Judge Howard Gates, a man whose name was whispered in Chicago's legal circles with a mix of fear and disdain. His reputation for a biting tongue and rulings that danced on the edge of capriciousness made him a force to be reckoned with. And today, that force was aimed squarely at her. The case she brought before the court was a powder keg of corruption. Charles Lawson, a real estate tycoon with a fortune built on the backs of Chicago's taxpayers, stood accused of siphoning millions in municipal funds into his private ventures. His connections ran deep, threading through the city's political elite like veins of gold in a mine. And Michelle had spent countless nights unraveling the tangled web of his deceit. Her evidence was meticulous. Bank statements cross-referenced with city budgets, internal memos from Lawson's company, contracts obtained through hard-fought subpoenas, each piece a bullet in her arsenal. But as she approached the plaintiff's table, Gates didn't even glance her way. He sat hunched over a thick file, flipping pages with a slowness that bordered on theatrical, letting the silence stretch until it pressed against every corner of the room. So, it wasn't just a procedural pause. It was a deliberate flex, a silent declaration that he controlled the tempo, the narrative, the power. Finally, he lifted his head just enough to speak, his voice a low growl dripping with condescension, his eyes still fixed on the papers. "Mrs. Obama, I assume you've brought something of actual substance today, or are we about to endure another one of your grand but empty performances?" A ripple of muffled laughter rolled from the defense table, where Lawson's legal team lounged in their tailored suits, their smirks as sharp as their cufflinks. Michelle didn't flinch. She'd faced skeptics and adversaries who underestimated her, men who saw her as an outsider, a woman who didn't belong, and she'd learned long ago that composure was her greatest weapon. "Your Honor," she said, her voice ringing clear and steady through the room. "I believe the evidence will speak louder than any performance. This case involves the theft of Chicago taxpayers' money, and my duty is to ensure the facts are laid bare for all to see." Gates leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his bulk, his posture a parody of boredom that didn't quite mask the glint in his eyes. "Taxpayers' money?" he repeated, dragging the words out with a sneer. "That's never been the foundation for a frivolous case before, has it? I've heard that tune so many times it's lost all meaning." The jab was sharp, a calculated attempt to undermine her before she could even begin, but Michelle's expression remained a fortress. "With all due respect, Your Honor," she replied, her tone unwavering, "I wouldn't classify felony corruption charges as frivolous. They're a betrayal of this city and its people." For a fleeting moment, their eyes met, his cold and calculating, hers a wall of unyielding resolve, and the air between them crackled with unspoken tension. But before she could build her momentum, he cut her off again, his voice slicing through hers like a blade. "Mrs. Obama, spare me the sanctimonious lectures and get to the point. I don't have all day to indulge whatever self-righteous crusade you've cooked up." A murmur spread through the gallery like a wave breaking against the shore. The courtroom wasn't packed. Only a handful of reporters lined the back rows, their pens poised over notepads. A scattering of curious onlookers filled the benches, and the jury sat stiffly in their box, their faces a mix of curiosity and unease. But the atmosphere shifted perceptibly. Judges could be stern, even abrasive, but this was different, a personal edge that cut through the veneer of judicial impartiality. Michelle took a slow, deliberate breath, her mind racing as she recalibrated her approach. She knew what Gates was doing. He wanted her rattled, wanted to paint her as an overzealous interloper rather than a lawyer with a rock-solid case. But she wasn't about to let him dictate the narrative. She reached for a folder on the table and flipped it open with a practiced ease that belied the storm within her. Your Honor, I'd like to direct the court's attention to Exhibit A. These financial records clearly demonstrate— Mrs. Obama, Gates interrupted, his voice sharp enough to draw blood. Do you always insist on drowning people in paperwork? Or is this just your way of compensating for a case that's got no legs to stand on? The room tilted on its axis. The defense attorney, a wiry man in a navy pinstripe suit with slicked-back hair, smirked openly, his eyes glinting with amusement. A few reporters exchanged glances, their pens scratching faster across their pads. The insult landed like a punch, a low blow designed to humiliate her in front of the entire courtroom. But Michelle didn't react. Not outwardly. She'd faced men like Gates before, men who thrived on intimidation, who used their authority as a battering ram rather than a shield for justice. The key was to never let them see you waver, to turn their own tactics against them. She paused, just long enough to let the silence reclaim the space, a silent rebuke to his outburst, then set the folder down with a soft thud and clasped her hands together in front of her. Your Honor, she said, her voice calm but laced with a steel that cut through the tension. If you'd prefer to make this personal rather than professional, I'm happy to request a recess while we address any concerns you might have about my conduct, or yours. It was a deft move. Not aggressive, not disrespectful, but a pointed reminder that she wasn't here to be bullied, that she could push back without raising her voice. Gates's lips curled slightly, a flicker of something crossing his face. Was it amusement? Annoyance? It was hard to tell, but he wasn't done yet. Oh, I don't have concerns, Mrs. Obama, he replied, his tone dripping with sarcasm that bordered on venom. I just know a weak case when I see one, and this reeks of desperation. The reaction wasn't just murmurs now. A few gasps punctuated the air. A whisper hissed from the back of the room. Someone coughed nervously. This wasn't how a judge was supposed to conduct a hearing. It was a breach of decorum, a step into territory that felt personal, spiteful, almost desperate itself. Michelle could feel the weight of the room shifting, the eyes of the jurors, the reporters, the onlookers darting between her and Gates like spectators at a prize fight, waiting for the first real blow to land. She could have fired back, could have matched his venom with her own sharp retort. But that's what he wanted. A shouting match to derail her focus, to turn this into a spectacle rather than a pursuit of truth. Instead, she adjusted the lapels of her blazer with a deliberate calm, straightened the stack of papers before her with a precision that spoke of control, and looked him dead in the eye, her gaze unwavering. Then I suppose we should let the evidence do the talking, she said, her voice a quiet challenge that carried more weight than any shout could have. But as the words left her lips, she caught something in his expression. Not just the usual arrogance, not just the condescension she'd come to expect, but a flicker of something deeper, something that looked suspiciously like unease. It wasn't just disdain. It was the guarded look of a man who had something to hide, a man whose stake in this case might run deeper than his judicial robe suggested. And in that moment, she knew. This wasn't just courtroom theatrics. Gates wasn't merely being combative for the sake of his ego. He was protecting something, or someone, and that realization lit a fire in her that burned hotter than any insult he could throw. She pressed forward, undeterred, her voice steady as she resumed her argument. Your Honor, these documents show a clear discrepancy in the funding allocations for Lawson properties. The company received nearly triple the amount approved in the original city budget, and none of it was accounted for in Chicago's public records. She turned slightly, gesturing toward the projection screen where the financial statements glowed in stark black and white, the numbers a silent indictment that no amount of bluster could erase. If you'll look here, Mrs. Obama, Gates cut in again, his voice carrying that same smug edge, but with a faint tremor she hadn't noticed before. I hate to interrupt your little presentation, and believe me, I do hate it, but I think we've seen enough numbers for one day. They're not impressing anyone. She glanced at him, then back at the screen, her movements deliberate. He wasn't even trying to hide his bias anymore. His dismissals were blatant, almost reckless, as if he were daring her to call him out. "Your Honor," she said, keeping her tone measured but firm. "With all due respect, these numbers are the foundation of this case. They're not here to impress. They're here to prove." He scoffed, a harsh bark of a laugh that echoed off the walls. "And yet I fail to see anything that justifies wasting this court's time with your parade of figures." That phrase, "wasting time," landed like a gavel, a mantra he wielded to smother her argument before it could take root. She heard a soft rustle behind her, the prosecution team shifting in their seats, exchanging wary glances, their unease palpable. They felt it too. Something wasn't right, a thread of wrongness weaving through the proceedings like a crack in a dam about to burst. Michelle tightened her grip on her pen, her fingers pressing into the metal as she flipped to the next page in her file with a controlled flick. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit a motion to—" "Denied," Gates barked, cutting her off mid-sentence with a force that made the stenographer jump slightly in her seat. She looked up, her brow arching just enough to signal her surprise. "I haven't even stated the motion yet," she said, her voice calm but carrying a hint of incredulity. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench, his eyes narrowing to slits as he stared her down. "And yet I can already tell you it's going nowhere. Let's be honest, Mrs. Obama. This entire case is built on speculation, a little creative accounting spun into some grand tale of corruption. It's a house of cards, and I'm not here to watch it fall apart on my time." The defense attorney smirked again, his silence a testament to how little he needed to intervene. Gates was doing all the heavy lifting for him, dismantling her case with every barbed word. Michelle exhaled slowly, her mind racing behind the mask of her composure. "Your Honor," she said, her tone still even but now edged with a quiet defiance, "are you refusing to allow my motion before even hearing its contents?" A pause hung in the air, a beat too long, heavy with implication, the room holding its breath. "I'm refusing to indulge this circus act any longer," Gates snapped, his voice rising just enough to betray a crack in his carefully constructed facade. The courtroom wasn't just tense now. It was alive, buzzing with the energy of a moment teetering on the edge of chaos. Reporters scribbled furiously, their pens scratching like insects across paper. The jurors leaned forward, their eyes wide. Even the bailiff shifted his stance, his hand resting lightly on his belt as if sensing trouble brewing. Michelle caught the glance of a juror, a woman in her 50s, her dark blazer crisp against the muted tones of the courtroom, her brows furrowed, her lips pressed into a thin line of concern. The woman wasn't alone in noticing the shift. The gallery felt it too, a collective realization that this wasn't business as usual. Arrogance, Michelle knew, had a way of drawing attention, of making people lean in when they might otherwise look away, and Gates was handing her that advantage with every overreach. She squared her shoulders, her resolve hardening. "Very well, Your Honor," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Then let's proceed with the next piece of evidence." She turned back to the screen, clicking to the next slide with a precision that belied the storm raging inside her. "This document, obtained through a subpoena, shows a contract signed between Lawson Properties and the Chicago Planning Commission, outlining the proposed project expenses. You'll notice that the listed costs total just over $2 million. She paused, letting the weight of the moment settle, then placed another sheet on the projector with a deliberate slowness that commanded attention. However, this is an internal ledger from Lawson Properties, showing that the actual funds transferred were nearly double that amount, almost $4 million to be exact. She laid a third document down beside it, her movements measured, her voice steady as she delivered the blow. "And here is the approval signature, signed off by—" She hesitated just long enough to let the anticipation build, her eyes flicking up to meet Gates's for a split second before she finished. Judge Howard Gates. The courtroom didn't just shift, it fractured, a crack splitting through the air as if the very walls had gasped. Eyes widened, mouths dropped open, a ripple of movement surged through the gallery, pens scratched, heads turned, the defense attorney stiffened, his smirk wiped clean in an instant. Gates didn't move, his face unreadable for the first time since she'd stepped into the room, a statue carved from stone and silence. Michelle let the silence hang, heavy and suffocating, before she continued, her voice calm but carrying the weight of a guillotine. Your Honor, would you like to explain why your signature appears on an unauthorized financial transaction involving the defendant? It was a calculated risk. She didn't have the full story yet, not every thread of the conspiracy laid bare, but she had enough to shake the foundation beneath him, to force him to react. Gates finally stirred, shifting slightly in his seat, his fingers pressing together until his knuckles whitened, a faint tremor betraying his composure. That document, he said, his voice slow and deliberate, each word weighed down with forced calm, is inadmissible. She tilted her head slightly, her expression neutral, but her eyes piercing. How so? It was obtained improperly, he replied, his tone tightening like a wire about to snap. She let that sink in for a moment, then countered, Your Honor, this document was subpoenaed by my office, fully within legal bounds. His nostrils flared, a flash of anger breaking through his mask. Then it was mishandled, he snapped, his voice rising. I'm ruling it inadmissible. It will not be considered by this court, and that's final. The room erupted, not in noise, but in a tidal wave of motion. The jurors whispered to each other, their heads shaking in disbelief. The stenographer's fingers paused over her keys, her eyes darting up. Even the bailiff took a step forward, his brow furrowing. Michelle crossed her arms, her stance unshaken, her tone as calm as a still lake, but with a current running beneath it. You do realize this is a public hearing, correct? She said, her words deliberate. That the media is here, that every single person in this room just saw you declare critical financial evidence inadmissible without a shred of legal reasoning? A muscle in his jaw jumped, a vein pulsing at his temple as he glared at her, his control slipping. That's enough, Mrs. Obama, he growled, his voice low and dangerous. She didn't move, didn't blink, her gaze locked on his. Then, slowly, deliberately, she reached into her satchel and pulled out a small, sleek recorder, its black surface gleaming under the courtroom lights. She placed it on the table with a soft click that echoed like a gunshot in the silence, and pressed play. A voice filled the room. Low, gruff, unmistakable, a voice every person present recognized as Gates. Take care of it, the recording crackled. I don't care how you do it. Just make sure she doesn't get her hands on those ledgers. The silence that followed was absolute, a void so thick it seemed to swallow the air itself. Gates didn't move, didn't breathe, his face frozen in a mask of shock and fury, his eyes locked on the recorder as if he could will it to disappear. Michelle didn't look at him. She didn't need to. She kept her gaze on the device, letting the weight of his own words bury him, letting the room feel the gravity of what they'd just heard. The defense attorney blinked rapidly, his composure slipping, the smirk replaced by a look of dawning dread. Lawson himself, seated behind his lawyer, went pale, his hands trembling faintly on the table. The jurors stared, wide-eyed, some leaning forward, others clutching the arms of their chairs. The reporters in the back were a flurry of motion, their pens racing across pages, their phones buzzing silently as they typed out frantic updates. When the recording ended, leaving nothing but that suffocating silence in its wake, Gates cleared his throat, his voice hoarse and unsteady. Mrs. Obama, he said, struggling to regain control. I don't know where you obtained that recording, but... That's not the question you should be asking, Your Honor, she interrupted, her voice cutting through his like a blade through silk, smooth and lethal. The real question is who you were talking to, and what exactly you were so desperate to hide. His fingers curled into fists on the bench, his knuckles white, his chest rising and falling faster now. This is outrageous, he snapped, his voice cracking with a mix of anger and panic. This entire hearing is descending into chaos because of your grandstanding antics. Chaos? Michelle repeated, her tone light, almost amused, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips that didn't reach her eyes. I'd say this is clarity, Your Honor. Finally, some transparency in this courtroom, cutting through the smoke and mirrors. The tension hitched up another notch, a live wire sparking through the room, electrifying every breath. She reached for another document from her satchel and slid it across the table with a slow, deliberate motion. her fingers lingering on the paper for a moment before she pulled back. "This is a transcript of a wiretap, legally obtained during our investigation," she said, tapping the top of the page with a single, precise motion. "It corroborates everything you just heard on that recording. Every word, every implication." She turned slightly, nodding to the bailiff, a tall man with a stern face and a uniform pressed to perfection. "Officer Reynolds, would you kindly read the highlighted section aloud?" The bailiff hesitated, his eyes flicking between her and Gates, then stepped forward and picked up the transcript, his voice steady, but carrying the weight of the words as he read. "We'll take care of her. Obama doesn't have anything solid yet, but if she does, I'll make sure it never sees the inside of a courtroom." A sharp inhale came from someone in the gallery, a sound that sliced through the stillness like a knife. Michelle folded her hands together, her posture relaxed but her eyes blazing with purpose. "I'd like to submit this as evidence, Your Honor," she said, her voice a quiet command. Gates stared at the page, his chest heaving, his hands trembling faintly now, though he tried to hide it by pressing them flat against the bench. "Motion denied," he barked, his voice a fraction too loud, too shrill, the gavel slamming down with a force that made the wood groan. Michelle raised an eyebrow, her expression unruffled. "Excuse me?" "This hearing is over," he continued, his words tumbling out in a rush, his control unraveling thread by thread. "I will not allow this travesty to—" "Judge Gates," Michelle said smoothly, cutting him off with a calm that belied the storm she was about to unleash. "I wasn't asking for your permission." She turned toward the back of the courtroom and gave the smallest, subtlest nod, a gesture so understated it might have gone unnoticed if the room hadn't been hanging on her every move. The double doors at the rear swung open with a bang, and a firm, authoritative voice rang out, cutting through the chaos like a thunderclap. "Judge Howard Gates, you are under arrest." Gasps erupted from every corner of the room, sharp, jagged sounds of shock and disbelief. Reporters fumbled for their phones, their fingers flying over screens. Cameras clicked and flashed, capturing the moment in bursts of light. The jurors gaped, their faces a gallery of stunned expressions. Even Lawson, the powerful developer who had walked in expecting a formality, looked genuinely shaken, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. Gates didn't turn, didn't speak. He just sat there, his eyes fixed on a single point on his bench, his body rigid as if he could make the world disappear by sheer force of will. But reality had already caught up with him. Two uniformed officers flanked him, their boots thudding against the floor with military precision, one reaching into his pocket for a pair of handcuffs that gleamed coldly under the fluorescent lights. "This is absurd," Gates muttered, his voice low and hollow, the fight draining from him even as he spoke. The officer didn't blink, his tone flat and procedural as he responded, "You have the right to remain silent," and the sound of metal clicking shut around Gates's wrists was deafening, a sharp, final note that reverberated through the room like a death knell. Michelle remained seated, her face unreadable, her hands resting lightly on the table in front of her. This wasn't about gloating or revenge. This was about justice, about holding a system accountable when it had failed the people it was meant to serve. Gates finally found his voice, his words coming out in a low, trembling whisper as the officers pulled him to his feet. "You can't do this," he said, his eyes darting wildly around the room, searching for an ally, a lifeline. The officer holding his arm didn't flinch. "Sir, you are being taken into custody for obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit fraud, and abuse of judicial power. You'll have your chance to speak with an attorney." Gates yanked against the cuffs, his face flushing red, his voice rising in a desperate pitch. "This is a disgrace. I am the law in this courtroom." Michelle stood then, straightening her blazer with a calm that contrasted sharply with the chaos unfolding around her, her movements deliberate and composed. "Not anymore," she said, her voice soft, but cutting through the noise like a blade, a simple statement that carried the weight of finality. The room went dead silent again, a collective breath held as the reality of his downfall settled over them like a heavy fog. A lifetime of unchecked power had evaporated in an instant, and Gates' face twisted, his jaw clenching, his eyes darting from face to face in the gallery. Reporters, jurors, onlookers, searching for someone, anyone, who would stand up and declare this a mistake, a misunderstanding. But no one moved, no one spoke, because it wasn't a mistake. It was the truth catching up to him at last. A few feet away, the defense attorney had gone ghost white, his earlier smugness replaced by a look of sheer panic as he whispered urgently to Lawson, who sat frozen, his fingers digging into the table, his breathing shallow and rapid. Michelle let her eyes linger on Lawson for just a moment, a silent acknowledgement of his unraveling, before turning back to Gates as the officers began escorting him toward the side exit. But before they could reach the door, Lawson shot to his feet, his chair scraping against the floor with a harsh screech that made the room flinch. "Wait, wait," he stammered, his voice cracking, his eyes darting between Gates and Michelle like a trapped animal. "This is getting out of hand. We can work something out." Michelle turned to him, arching an eyebrow, her expression cool and assessing. "Work something out?" she repeated, her tone laced with a faint, almost imperceptible amusement. Lawson swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing, his carefully constructed facade crumbling before their eyes. I mean, there's no need for this kind of public spectacle," he said, his words tumbling over each other in a rush. "Let's be reasonable here." Michelle studied him for a long moment, her gaze steady and unyielding, then took a single step forward, closing the distance between them just enough to make him squirm. "You seem nervous, Mr. Lawson," she said, her voice low and deliberate, each word a pinprick. "Why would that be?" He shook his head, forcing a laugh that sounded more like a choke, his hands trembling as he raised them in a feeble gesture of denial. "Nervous? No, this is insane. You don't seriously believe Gates is guilty, do you? This is all some kind of misunderstanding." She let the question hang in the air, unanswered, her silence more damning than any response could have been. The officers moved again, leading Gates through the door, his protests fading into a muffled echo as it slammed shut behind him. The weight of the moment settled over the courtroom like a thick, oppressive fog. This wasn't just a case anymore. It was the unraveling of a system that had been protected, shielded, and nurtured for far too long. And Michelle wasn't done yet. She glanced back at the jury, their faces a mix of shock and awe, then at the judge's empty seat, its vacancy a symbol of the shift that had just taken place, and finally at the defense table, where Lawson sat rigid, his fingers tapping a frantic rhythm against the wood. "I believe we still have a trial to finish," she said, her voice cutting through the stunned murmurs that had begun to ripple through the room. But after what had just happened, everyone present knew this was only the beginning, the opening salvo in a war that would expose more than just one corrupt judge. The courtroom felt different now, lighter somehow, as if the weight of years of hidden deals and backroom promises had been lifted in an instant. Gates was gone, hauled out in handcuffs, his once commanding presence reduced to a figure of disgrace, but the shock of his arrest still lingered in the air like the final note of a symphony, resonant and unresolved. Michelle took her seat again, adjusting the papers in front of her with a calm that belied the chaos she'd just ignited, her focus shifting back to the defense table. Lawson had gone eerily quiet, his usual swagger replaced by a cold, calculating stillness, his eyes darting as if he were mentally mapping an escape route. She could see the wheels turning in his head. Without Gates on the bench, his legal team would have to fight this case on its own merits, and they had none to stand on. She leaned forward slightly, her voice low but carrying the weight of inevitability. "Mr. Lawson," she said, "would you like to continue with today's proceedings, or would you prefer to discuss a plea?" His jaw clenched, his fingers stilling on the table, his silence a confession in itself. "This is a witch hunt," he muttered finally, his voice barely audible, a last gasp of defiance. Michelle gave a small, almost imperceptible smile, the kind that didn't reach her eyes but spoke volumes. "No, Mr. Lawson," she said, her tone firm and final. "This is justice." He scoffed, a sharp, bitter sound, but it lacked conviction, his bravado crumbling under the weight of his own guilt. "You think taking down one corrupt judge changes anything?" he said, his voice rising slightly, a desperate attempt to reclaim some semblance of control. "You think this means you've won?" She didn't respond right away, letting the silence stretch between them, letting the weight of the moment sink in, her gaze steady and unrelenting. "I think it means the system still works," she said at last, her words measured and deliberate, each one landing like a stone in still water. I think it means that no matter how powerful someone believes they are, the truth will always catch up to them in the end. Lawson exhaled sharply, a sound that was half laugh, half surrender, but he had nothing left to say, no defense to offer. The prosecution team exchanged glances behind her, their faces a mix of relief and determination, and one of her colleagues leaned in, his voice a hushed whisper. This might be a good time to push for a deal. He's cracking. Michelle considered it, her eyes flicking to the jury, who watched her with a mix of awe and anticipation, their faces etched with the memory of what they'd just witnessed. A moment they'd never forget, a story they'd tell for years. The reporters in the back were still scribbling, their hands moving furiously across their notepads, their phones buzzing with the first drafts of headlines that would shake Chicago to its core. But she wasn't about to let this end with a whisper, a quiet plea deal that swept the deeper rot under the rug. She stood again, her movements smooth and purposeful, her voice rising to address the room. "To the presiding judge who will take over this case," she began, then paused, correcting herself with a faint nod to the empty bench. "I'd like to submit a formal request to proceed with additional evidence. Given what we've uncovered today, it's clear we need a full investigation into how far this corruption reaches." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, a wave of sound that grew louder as her words sank in. "Judge Gates was only part of the problem," she continued, her voice gaining strength, resonating with a conviction that filled the space. "If my team could uncover this, his signature, his voice on tape, his attempts to bury the truth, it means there's more out there, more names, more deals, more people who thought they were untouchable, who thought they could hide behind power and privilege." She turned to Lawson, her gaze locking onto his, her presence a force he couldn't escape. "So I'll ask you again, Mr. Lawson. Do you want to talk?" He sat rigid, his fingers tapping against the table in a nervous rhythm, his mind clearly racing as he weighed his options. Fight and risk everything, or fold and hope for mercy. Then, finally, he exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that seemed to drain the last of his resistance. "If I do," he said, his voice low and hoarse, "I want protection. Full protection." Michelle nodded slowly, her expression unreadable but her eyes sharp with purpose. "Then you'd better start talking," she said, her tone a quiet command that left no room for doubt. Names, dates, details, everything. But the shocks weren't over. As Lawson opened his mouth, his lips trembling as he prepared to spill secrets he'd guarded for years, a side door banged open with a force that made the room jump, the sound echoing off the walls like a gunshot. A woman stumbled in, her hair disheveled, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and defiance, clutching a thick manila envelope in her shaking hands. "Wait," she shouted, her voice raw and desperate, cutting through the stunned silence that followed. Michelle turned, her breath catching as she recognized the figure. Ellen Carter, a former clerk in Gates' office who had vanished from Chicago months ago, rumored to have left under mysterious circumstances. "I have proof," Ellen cried, thrusting the envelope forward as she staggered toward the plaintiff's table, her legs unsteady, but her resolve unbroken. "He threatened me. Gates. He said he'd ruin me if I didn't destroy the originals." The gallery erupted. Sharp gasps, shouted questions, the rustle of bodies leaning forward. Michelle reached out, taking the envelope with a steady hand, her pulse quickening as she tore it open and pulled out a stack of papers, original ledgers, their edges worn, but their contents pristine, each page bearing signatures in bold ink. Gates, Lawson, and, shockingly, Mayor Patricia Hines, Chicago's rising political star, a woman whose name had been floated for governor, whose pristine public image had just been shattered in a single stroke. "The mayor!" A juror gasped aloud, her voice breaking the stunned silence, her words echoing the disbelief that rippled through the room. Lawson shot to his feet again, his face ashen, his voice a panicked shout. "She's lying! I don't know her! Never seen her!" But the crack in his voice betrayed him, his denial ringing hollow against the weight of the evidence in Michelle's hands. She held up the ledgers, her movements slow and deliberate, letting the room see every damning detail. "Your Honor, or rather Mr. Gates," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos with a calm that belied the bombshell she'd just dropped. "Perhaps you'd like to explain why your signature appears alongside the mayor's on these unauthorized transactions. And Mr. Lawson, care to clarify your role?" Gates, still cuffed and flanked by officers near the exit, went deathly pale, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. "This is a setup," he roared, his voice hoarse with desperation, his body straining against the restraints. "A lie!" Ellen stepped forward, tears streaming down her face, but her voice steady now, her fear giving way to fury. "He threatened me," she said, pointing a trembling finger at Gates. "Told me to burn them, said the mayor would protect him, that no one would ever find out. I couldn't do it. I hid them instead, and I've been running ever since." The room was a powder keg now, every word a spark threatening to ignite it. Michelle turned to Lawson, her gaze piercing. "Still want that deal?" He sank back into his chair, sweat beading on his forehead, his hands shaking as he gripped the table. I'll talk," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the growing din. "Everything, Hines, Gates, the others, just get me out of this." She nodded, her expression hard. "Then start naming names, right now. But before Lawson could speak, another jolt rocked the courtroom. The main doors burst open again, and two men in dark suits stormed in, their strides purposeful, their faces grim. They flashed badges that glinted under the lights. FBI. "Hold it!" the taller one barked, his voice cutting through the chaos like a siren. "This case is now under federal jurisdiction. We've been tracking a broader network tied to these transactions. Gates, Lawson, Hines, and beyond. We're taking over." The room lost its collective mind. Screams, shouts, the clatter of chairs as reporters leapt to their feet, phones buzzing with a frenzy of activity. Michelle stood still amid the storm, her mind racing but her exterior a pillar of calm. The FBI's arrival was a shock, a twist she hadn't anticipated, but it only confirmed what she'd suspected. This corruption ran deeper than Chicago, a rot that reached into the veins of power itself. She faced the agents, her voice steady. "I'll cooperate fully," she said, "but I request a public investigation, every name, every deal exposed." The agent nodded, his expression grim. "You've just blown the lid off something big, Mrs. Obama. We'll take it from here." Lawson began muttering names under his breath, a frantic litany of confession. Hines, city council members, a state senator, each word a domino toppling a larger structure. Ellen sank into a chair, sobbing with relief. Gates was dragged out, his yells fading into the hall. The jury stared, mouths agape, as the FBI agents moved to secure the scene. Michelle turned to the room, her voice rising above the chaos. "This isn't just a trial anymore. It's accountability. No one is above the law." The courtroom pulsed with a raw, chaotic energy. Fear, awe, hope colliding in a maelstrom. Reporters raced to file stories that would dominate headlines for weeks. Lawson's confessions spilled like blood from a wound. The FBI's presence promised a reckoning beyond Chicago's borders. Michelle Obama had walked in to prosecute a case. She'd leave having sparked a revolution, a tidal wave of truth that would crash through every layer of corruption it touched. The fight was far from over, but the first battle was hers, and the city, perhaps the nation, would never be the same.